Hello there, and welcome to Deep Sleep Seas. If you've found your way here tonight, perhaps you're feeling the gentle pull toward rest, or maybe you're someone who finds comfort in the slow unfolding of ocean mysteries as you drift toward sleep. Either way, this journey is for you. You have nowhere to be, nothing to do but let your breathing slow and your thoughts soften like waves settling after a storm. But before we jump in, if you enjoy learning about our oceans, you're welcome to let us know where you're tuning in from and what time is it for you. It's always fascinating to see how far our stories reach, and if these quiet ocean journeys help you unwind, you're always welcome to subscribe so you can drift off with us whenever you need. Now let your body grow a little heavier as we begin. Pressure is something we live with every moment, though we rarely notice it. Right now, as you rest wherever you are, the entire atmosphere of Earth presses down upon you. All that air, stretching upward for miles and miles until it thins into the darkness of space, has weight. That weight creates pressure. At sea level, this atmospheric pressure amounts to about 14.7 pounds pressing on every square inch of your body. You don't feel it, of course, because your body has adapted to it. The fluids inside you push outward with equal force, creating a perfect balance. You were born into this pressure, and it feels like nothing at all. But the ocean is different. Water is far denser than air, about 800 times heavier for the same volume. This means that the pressure increases much more rapidly as you move downward through water than it does as you move downward through air. If you could somehow walk down a staircase through the atmosphere, descending hundreds of feet, you'd barely notice any change in air pressure. But in water, those same hundreds of feet would make an enormous difference. The change is swift and relentless. The rule is simple and elegant. For every 33 feet you descend in seawater, the pressure increases by 1 atmosphere. Another 14.7 pounds per square inch added to whatever pressure was already there. At the surface, you're under 1 atmosphere of pressure from the air. Descend to 33 feet beneath the waves, and you're under 2 atmospheres. 1 from the air above the water, and 1 from the water itself. Go down to 66 feet, and you're under 3 atmospheres. The progression is linear and predictable. A steady march toward crushing force. This might not sound like much at first. 3 atmospheres doesn't seem catastrophic, but the ocean is deeper than most people realize, and the depths go on and on. The average depth of the world's oceans is around 12,400 feet. That's more than 2 miles of water. At that average depth, the pressure is roughly 370 times greater than at the surface. 370 atmospheres pressing in from all directions. And that's just the average. There are places much deeper, places where the ocean floor drops away into trenches that descend for miles more, trenches where the pressure climbs into realms that challenge our ability to comprehend. To put it in more familiar terms, imagine stacking elephants. A single elephant weighs several tons. At the bottom of the deepest parts of the ocean, the pressure is equivalent to having 50 elephants standing on a single postage stamp. Or think of it another way. If you could somehow survive at those depths, the water pressing against your body would be exerting more than 8 tons of force on every square inch of your skin. 8 tons on every single square inch. The weight is distributed evenly from all directions, which is important, but the magnitude is almost beyond imagination. Pressure is measured in different units, depending on where you are and what field you're working in. Scientists often use bars or atmospheres. Engineers might prefer pounds per square inch, abbreviated as psi. At sea level, 1 atmosphere equals 1 bar, which equals about 14.7 poles. These are just different ways of expressing the same thing, different languages for describing weight pressing inward. In the deepest trenches, the pressure reaches values like 1,086 bars, or 15,750 poles, or 1,086 atmospheres. The numbers are staggering, no matter how you express them. This pressure doesn't simply push down from above. Water is a fluid, and fluids transmit pressure equally in all directions. If you're deep underwater, the pressure pushes against you from every angle. It presses on your chest and your back simultaneously. It pushes against your head from above and from below and from the sides. There's no escape from it. No way to orient yourself to reduce it. It's omnipresent and inescapable, a fundamental characteristic of being surrounded by something heavy. The physics behind this is straightforward. Pressure in a fluid is determined by the weight of the fluid above you. and the area over which that weight is distributed. The deeper you go, the more fluid sits above you, and the more that fluid weighs, every foot of additional depth adds more weight to the column of water overhead. The relationship is direct and proportional. Double the depth and you double the pressure from the water, though you always add that 1 atmosphere from the air on top. For humans, this pressure presents immediate challenges. Our bodies contain air spaces, pockets of gas that can be compressed. Your lungs are the most obvious example. They're filled with air at whatever pressure surrounds you. At the surface, that's 1 atmosphere. If you dive to 33 feet, the water pressure doubles, and if you held your breath, that pressure would try to compress your lungs to half their volume. This is part of why diving is dangerous and requires training. The air you breathe must be at the same pressure as the water around you, or your lungs can't expand to draw it in. But for the creatures that live in the deep ocean, creatures that have never known the surface, pressure is simply a fact of existence. They're born into it. They live their entire lives surrounded by it. Their bodies are adapted in ways that make the pressure irrelevant to them, or at least manageable. They don't have air-filled lungs in the way we do. Their internal structures are built differently. For them, the crushing force that would kill a human in an instant is simply the normal state of affairs, as unremarkable as the air pressure we experience is to us. The ocean's pressure is invisible, silent, and utterly unforgiving. It doesn't care about strength or willpower. It doesn't respect technology or ambition. It simply is. A physical law written into the fabric of water and depth and gravity. And understanding it is the first step toward understanding the deep ocean itself. That vast three-dimensional realm where light never reaches, and the weight of the world above presses down without mercy. The ocean is not uniform. It's not a single vast swimming pool of consistent temperature and light and pressure. Instead, it's layered, divided into distinct zones that differ dramatically from one another. These zones are defined by depth, and with depth come changes in light, temperature, and of course pressure. As you descend from the sun-warmed surface into the cold darkness below, you pass through boundaries as real as the borders between countries, though these borders are invisible and defined entirely by physics and biology. The topmost layer is called the epipelagic zone, though many people know it better as the sunlight zone. This is the ocean we think of when we imagine tropical waters or coastal swims. It extends from the surface down to about 660 feet, though the exact depth varies depending on how clear the water is. In the clearest tropical waters, sunlight can penetrate deeper. In murky coastal areas, it reaches less far. This is the only part of the ocean where photosynthesis can occur at significant levels, where plants and algae can harness the sun's energy to create food from carbon dioxide and water. Light penetrates water differently than it passes through air. The ocean absorbs light rapidly, even clear seawater. Within the first 30 feet, about half the sun's energy is absorbed and converted to heat. This is why the surface of the ocean can be warm even on a cloudy day. The water is constantly drinking in energy from above, but not all colors of light penetrate equally. Red light, with its longer wavelengths, is absorbed first. Within 30 feet, almost all red light is gone. This is why everything looks blue when you dive, even things you know to be red or orange. The colors simply aren't there anymore. The light has been filtered out by the water itself. By the time you reach a depth of around 600 feet, even in the clearest ocean, about 99% of surface light has been absorbed. Only the deepest blue wavelengths remain, and even those are faint. This is the bottom edge of the epipelagic zone, the last place where sunlight has any meaningful presence. Below this depth, darkness begins to take over. The transition between zones isn't always sharp, but there's often a distinct layer where temperature changes rapidly. This is the thermocline, a boundary where warm surface water meets the colder water below. In tropical regions, the thermocline can be quite strong and relatively permanent. The surface water is heated by the sun day after day, becoming significantly warmer than the depths. But this heat doesn't penetrate far. It takes an enormous amount of energy to warm water because water has a very high heat capacity. It can absorb tremendous amounts of heat without its temperature rising very much, so the warmth stays near the surface, creating a cap of warm water floating atop the cold, deep ocean. In temperate regions, the thermocline varies with the seasons. During summer, the sun warms the surface and the thermocline becomes more pronounced. The warm layer on top might extend down 100 feet or more, creating a distinct division between surface and depth. But in winter, cooling temperatures and stronger storms mix the water more thoroughly, and the thermocline weakens or disappears entirely. The ocean becomes more uniform in temperature from top to bottom, at least in the upper layers. Below the apelagic zone lies the mesopelagic, sometimes called the twilight zone. This extends from about 600 feet down to around 3,300 feet. Here, there's still a little light, but it's dim and blue and barely sufficient for vision. Some animals can see in this murky realm, using large eyes or special adaptations to gather every photon they can. But there's nowhere near enough light for photosynthesis. This is a realm of consumers, not producers. Animals here must eat other animals or rely on food that drifts down from above. At this depth, the pressure has already climbed to impressive levels. At the bottom of the mesopelagic zone, at 3,000 feet, the pressure is roughly 91 atmospheres. That's more than 1,300 pi. Any airspace would be compressed to a tiny fraction of its surface volume. The cold is also increasing. Surface waters might be warm, but here, temperatures hover in the range of 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and they continue to drop as you descend. Below the mesopelagic is the bathypelagic zone, the midnight zone. This extends from around 3,000 feet down to about 13,000 feet. Here, there is no sunlight at all. The darkness is absolute, broken only by bioluminescence, the living light produced by creatures that have evolved to generate their own glow. The temperature stabilizes at around 38 to 39 degrees Fahrenheit, just a few degrees above freezing. It remains fairly constant at this temperature throughout the bathypelagic and deeper zones, creating one of the most thermally stable environments on Earth. The pressure in the bathypelagic zone ranges from roughly 90 atmospheres at the top to nearly 400 atmospheres at the bottom. This is where the weight of the ocean above becomes truly staggering. 400 atmospheres means nearly 6,000 pi. It's a force that would instantly compress any gas to almost nothing and would crush any structure not specifically designed to withstand it. Deeper still lies the abyssopelagic zone, the abyss. This extends from around 13,000 feet down to about 20,000 feet, just above the ocean floor in most places. The pressure here ranges from around 400 atmospheres up to 600 atmospheres or more. Temperatures remain constant, near freezing. Food is scarce because very little organic matter makes it this far down without being consumed on the way. Life here is sparse, adapted to long periods of starvation, capable of surviving on almost nothing. And then, deeper than the abyssal plain, there are the trenches. These are the Hadal Zone, named after Hades, the Greek underworld. The Hadal Zone includes any depth below 20,000 feet, down to the very deepest points in the ocean. This is where the ocean floor has been pulled down by tectonic forces, where one crustal plate slides beneath another and creates enormous gashes in the seafloor. The Hadal Zone is rare, making up less than 1/4% of the ocean's area, but it accounts for 40% of the ocean's total depth range. These trenches are the ultimate extreme, the places where pressure reaches its absolute maximum. Each of these zones is distinct, defined not just by depth, but by the unique combination of pressure, temperature, light, and chemistry that exists there. Creatures that thrive in one zone often cannot survive in another. The adaptations required for living under 10 atmospheres are different from those needed for 1,000 atmospheres. And so the ocean is not just layered by depth, but by life itself, with different communities occupying different levels, each shaped by the specific conditions of their realm. Let's imagine a descent, a slow journey downward through the water column, and let's pay attention to what happens to the pressure as we go. Start at the surface, floating peacefully, where the water meets the air. Here, the pressure is 1 atmosphere, 14.7 pors, comfortable and familiar. The sunlight is bright, the water perhaps warm, and the world seems welcoming. This is where humans naturally belong, where we can swim and dive with only the protection of our skin and lungs. Now descend just 10 feet. Already the pressure has increased noticeably, though not dramatically. It's now about 1.3 atmospheres, or 19 psi. You can feel it in your ears if you're not equalizing. A slight sense of compression, your sinuses might feel the change. But it's manageable, easy. Drop to 33 feet, and you've crossed a threshold. The pressure has doubled from what it was at the surface, 2 atmospheres, 29.4 psi. This is still well within the range of recreational scuba diving depths that thousands of people visit every day. But your body is already responding. The air in your lungs has been compressed to half the volume it would have at the surface. If you were free diving holding your breath, you'd notice your chest getting smaller, tighter. Your wetsuit, if you're wearing one, would be compressed as well, losing some of its insulating properties as the tiny bubbles in the neoform are squeezed. Continue down to 66 feet, and it's 3 atmospheres, 44 psi. Now the changes are more noticeable. Colors have shifted. Reds and oranges are gone, absorbed by the water above. Everything is painted in shades of blue and green. The light is dimmer. The water may be cooler if you've crossed through a thermocline, and the pressure is 3 times what you experience on land. For trained divers, this is still routine, but it's at these depths that nitrogen begins to dissolve into your blood in significant amounts, creating the risk of decompression sickness if you ascend too quickly later. At 100 feet, the pressure is around 4 atmospheres, about 59 psi. This is the depth where nitrogen narcosis can begin to affect divers, a strange drunken feeling caused by nitrogen gas acting as a mild anesthetic under pressure. Some divers feel it sooner, some later, but around 100 feet is common. The pressure is starting to become significant enough that you can't ignore it. It's affecting your physiology in ways that demand respect and caution. 200 feet deep, and we're at roughly 7 atmospheres, around 103 pi. This is beyond the range of recreational scuba diving. To safely visit this depth, you need special training, special gas mixtures, and very careful planning. The pressure is now 7 times greater than at the surface. A balloon brought from the surface would have shrunk to about 1/7 its original volume. Your body is under forces that evolution didn't prepare you for. Only through technology and understanding can humans visit here and return safely. At 330 feet, we're at 11 atmospheres, about 161 psi. This is approaching the maximum depth for conventional scuba diving with air. Deeper than this, the partial pressure of nitrogen becomes dangerously high, and divers must use mixed gases like Trimix to avoid narcosis and oxygen toxicity. The pressure is now 11 times what we're built for. The weight of the water column above is immense. 660 feet marks the approximate bottom of the sunlight zone, the last fading remnants of surface light. Here the pressure is around 21 atmospheres, 310 psi. This is 310 pounds pressing on every square inch of your body. If you could somehow be here without protection, your lungs would be crushed. Any airspace in your body would be compressed to less than 1/20th its surface volume. This is beyond human capability without sophisticated equipment. At 1,000 feet, we're at roughly 31 atmospheres, 460 psi. We're now firmly in the twilight zone, where only dim blue light remains. Most of the ocean's creatures live above this depth. Below it, conditions become increasingly extreme. The pressure is starting to enter realms where special materials are needed for any human-made structure to survive. Steel must be thick. Design must be careful. 3,000 feet marks the bottom of the mesopelagic zone. Here the pressure is about 92 atmospheres, 1,350 psi. This is the weight you'd feel if a fully loaded pickup truck were balanced on every square inch of your body. The cold is also intense now, hovering around 40 degrees. The darkness is complete except for bioluminescence. We've entered a realm where humans cannot go without specialized submersibles, where the ocean's power begins to truly dominate. At 6,000 feet, we're at roughly 183 atmospheres, 2,690 psi. The pressure has become almost incomprehensible. This is around the depth where the RMS Titanic rests on the ocean floor, and the pressure was strong enough to slowly crush and corrode the great ship over the decades. Any organic material not adapted to this depth would be destroyed instantly. 10,000 feet brings us to about 304 atmospheres, nearly 4,500 pi. This is deeper than the average ocean depth. Down here, the weight of water is so great that it affects the chemistry of seawater, influencing how gases dissolve and how reactions proceed. Temperature has stabilized at just above freezing and will remain there all the way to the bottom. Life is still present but sparse, specialized and strange. 20,000 feet is roughly 609 atmospheres, 8,950 psi. We've reached the Haddle Zone now, the realm of the trenches. Down here, the pressure is so extreme that only a handful of vehicles humans have ever built could survive it. The weight above is staggering. If you could somehow place a human body here, it wouldn't explode or burst in the dramatic way movies sometimes suggest, because human bodies are mostly water and water is incompressible. But the air in your lungs would be compressed into almost nothing, your sinuses would collapse, and you would die instantly from the sheer mechanical force. And still, we can go deeper. The trenches descend further, to depths where pressure becomes truly extreme. At 30,000 feet, the pressure is roughly 913 atmospheres, over 13,400 pi. At 35,000 feet, it's about 1,065 atmospheres, over 15,600 pi. And at the very bottom of the deepest trenches, at depths approaching 36,000 feet, the pressure reaches values like 1,086 atmospheres, or 15,750 phi. This is where our journey ends, at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, at a place called Challenger Deep. Here the pressure is so immense that it challenges our ability to build anything that can withstand it. The weight pressing inward is equivalent to the bite force of 50 great white sharks, all pressing on the same small area. It's like having the Empire State Building balanced on a dinner plate. It's a force that transforms materials, that makes submarines into potential death traps, that defines what is physically possible in engineering. And yet, life exists even here. Creatures move through this water as if it were the most natural thing in the world, adapted so thoroughly that the pressure means nothing to them. They were born in the crush, and they will die in the crush, and for them it's simply home. There is a place in the western Pacific Ocean, where the seafloor drops away into a chasm so deep that Mount Everest could be placed inside it and still be covered by more than a mile of water. This is the Mariana Trench, the deepest part of the world's oceans, a crescent-shaped scar in the Earth's crust that stretches for more than 1,500 miles and reaches depths that test the very limits of what we can explore. The trench lies east of the Mariana Islands, a chain of volcanic islands that give it its name. It was formed by a process called subduction, where one tectonic plate slides beneath another. The Pacific Plate, old and cold and dense, is being pushed under the smaller Mariana Plate. As it descends, it pulls the seafloor down with it, creating this enormous depression. The process is slow, just a few inches per year, but it's been happening for millions of years, and the result is the deepest place on Earth. The Mariana Trench is not uniformly deep. It's shaped like a crescent, with varying depths along its length. Most of it is deep, certainly, far deeper than the surrounding abyssal plain. But there's one section that stands out as extraordinary. This is the Challenger Deep, located near the southern end of the trench. It's the deepest known point in all the oceans, a small valley within an already deep trench, a place where the numbers become almost meaningless because our brains aren't built to comprehend such depths. The exact depth of Challenger Deep has been measured multiple times over the decades, and the measurements vary slightly depending on the method used and the exact location of the measurement. Early measurements were made with weighted ropes, literally dropping a line until it touched bottom and measuring how much rope was needed. Later echo sounders were used, sending down pulses of sound and timing how long they took to return from the seafloor. More recent measurements use sophisticated sonar and pressure sensors. The current best estimate places the deepest point at around 35,876 feet, or 10,935 meters below sea level. Some measurements have recorded slightly deeper readings, up to around 36,000 feet. But the uncertainty in these measurements means we can't be absolutely certain which specific spot is the very deepest. At this depth, the pressure is approximately 1,086 atmospheres, or 15,750 psi. To put that in perspective, it's more than 8 tons of force pressing on every square inch. Imagine an elephant standing on a postage stamp, except multiply that by about 50. The pressure is so great that it actually affects the properties of water itself. Water at the bottom of the Challenger Deep is slightly denser than water at the surface, compressed by the weight above, even though water is essentially incompressible under normal conditions. The temperature at the bottom of the trench is just above freezing, typically measured between 1 and 4 degrees Celsius. There is, of course, no sunlight. The darkness is complete and permanent. The only light comes from bioluminescent creatures, and even those are rare this deep. Food is scarce because most organic matter is consumed long before it can sink this far. And yet, life persists. Creatures live here, adapted to conditions that would seem impossible. Only a handful of people have ever been to the bottom of the Challenger Deep. The first were Jacques Piccard and Don Walsh, who descended in the bathyscaphe Trieste in 1960. Their journey took hours, sinking slowly through the water column in a vehicle that was essentially a large metal sphere suspended beneath a float filled with gasoline for buoyancy. When they reached the bottom, they spent only 20 minutes there. The sediment they disturbed on landing clouded the water so badly that they couldn't take clear photographs. But they saw life. Piccard reported seeing what he described as a flatfish, though some scientists have questioned whether it might have been a sea cucumber. Either way, it proved that life existed even at the greatest depths. For more than 50 years, no one returned. The Trieste dive was a remarkable achievement, but it didn't immediately open the deep ocean to exploration. The technology was expensive, the risks were high, and funding for such ventures was limited. It wasn't until 2012 that someone went back. Filmmaker James Cameron, building his own submersible called Deep Sea Challenger, made a solo descent to the bottom of the Challenger. His vehicle was more modern than Trieste, equipped with cameras and sampling equipment, but it still took hours to reach the bottom, and the pressure still presented enormous engineering challenges. Cameron spent several hours at depth, taking samples and filming before ascending back to the surface. Since then, a few others have made the journey, including Victor Vescovo, who reached the bottom in 2019 in a submersible specifically designed for repeat dives to full ocean depth. These dives have yielded valuable scientific data, samples of sediment and creatures, and images of what the deepest place looks like. What they found is remarkable. The seafloor is not a barren desert. There are creatures there. Amphipods, small shrimp-like crustaceans, are relatively abundant. Sea cucumbers crawl along the bottom. Strange fish with translucent bodies and bizarre adaptations swim slowly through the water. Even bacteria thrive, processing the limited nutrients that make it down from above. Perhaps most disturbingly, these dives have also found evidence of human impact, even at these extreme depths. Plastic bags have been discovered on the seafloor. Microplastics have been found in the tissues of amphipods living in the trench. Pollutants like PCBs, chemicals that have been banned for decades, are present in high concentrations in the fatty tissues of deep-sea creatures. The Mariana Trench is as remote as anywhere on Earth, about as far from human civilization as you can get while staying on the planet's surface, and yet we've managed to pollute it. The trench itself is part of a larger system of deep trenches that ring the Pacific Ocean. There are dozens of trenches, though most are not as deep as the Mariana. Together, these trenches make up the Hadal Zone, representing less than 1% of the ocean floor, but including the deepest 40% of the ocean's total depth range. They're unique environments, isolated from each other by vast stretches of relatively shallow abyssal plain, and each has evolved its own community of specialized creatures. The name Mariana Trench has become synonymous with extreme depth, with the ultimate challenge. It represents the lowest point on Earth's surface, the place where the ocean's weight is greatest, where pressure becomes a fundamental fact that dominates everything. To reach it is to push the boundaries of engineering and human courage. To survive there requires adaptations so specialized that creatures from the trench cannot live anywhere else. And to study it is to peer into one of the last truly unexplored realms on our planet, a place where darkness and pressure rule absolutely, and where life somehow finds a way. When you consider the pressure at the bottom of the ocean, the natural question is how anything can live there. The forces are so immense, so overwhelming, that it seems impossible for delicate living tissue to survive. And yet not only does life survive, it thrives. Creatures have colonized every depth of the ocean, from the warm sunlit surface down to the coldest, darkest, most pressure-filled trenches. The adaptations they've developed are remarkable, a testament to evolution's ability to solve even the most extreme challenges. The key to understanding how creatures survive pressure is to understand what pressure actually affects. Pressure compresses gases. A balloon brought from the surface to depth will shrink dramatically as the air inside is compressed. Your lungs, if you could somehow dive to great depth while holding your breath, would be squeezed down to a tiny fraction of their normal size. Air spaces are vulnerable because gases are compressible. Pressure can reduce their volume, and if they're inside a living organism, that compression can cause damage. But water is different. Water is essentially incompressible. You can apply enormous pressure to water, and its volume barely changes. The reason has to do with the molecular structure of water and the forces between water molecules. At the pressures found even in the deepest ocean trenches, water compresses by less than 5%. For practical purposes, it stays the same size. And deep-sea creatures are mostly made of water. Their bodies are more than 70% water, just like ours. This means that the pressure pressing in from outside is largely balanced by the pressure of the water inside them. There's no net crushing force trying to squeeze them, no gradient of pressure that would damage their tissues. They're in equilibrium with their environment. The pressure inside equals the pressure outside, and so it feels like nothing at all. This is very different from what would happen to a human at depth. Humans have air spaces. We have lungs filled with gas. We have sinuses. We have air in our middle ears. All of these spaces are vulnerable to pressure. If we were somehow transported instantly to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, the air in our lungs would be compressed to almost nothing. Our sinuses would collapse. The gases dissolved in our blood would come out of solution in a catastrophic form of decompression sickness. Even though we'd be experiencing compression, not decompression, we would not survive even briefly. But deep-sea fish don't have lungs in the way we do. Many fish have a swim bladder, an internal gas-filled sac that helps them control their buoyancy. But fish that live at great depths typically don't have swim bladders, or their swim bladders are filled with fats and oils rather than gas. This eliminates the problem of compression. There are no air spaces to be squeezed. Without those vulnerable pockets of gas, pressure becomes much less of a threat. However, pressure does affect things other than gases. It affects proteins, the complex molecules that do much of the work in living cells. Proteins are long chains of amino acids folded into precise three-dimensional shapes. These shapes are crucial to how proteins function. An enzyme's shape determines what chemical reactions it can catalyze. A structural protein's shape determines how strong it is and how it interacts with other proteins. Under high pressure, proteins can change shape. The pressure can push atoms closer together, disrupting the weak bonds that hold the protein in its proper configuration. This is a real problem, and it's one that deep-sea creatures have had to solve. One solution involves a small molecule called trimethylamine oxide, usually abbreviated as TMAO. This chemical is found in high concentrations in the tissues of many deep-sea fish and other creatures. TMAO is a sort of chemical chaperone. It interacts with proteins in ways that stabilize their structure, counteracting the effects of pressure. It's hydrophilic, meaning it loves water, and it seems to work by affecting how water molecules interact with proteins, preserving the proper shape even when pressure is trying to distort it. Researchers have found that the concentration of TMAO in fish tissues correlates with the depth at which the fish lives, at least up to a point. Fish from moderate depths have moderate amounts of TMAO. Fish from extreme depths have much higher concentrations. For a long time, scientists thought this relationship was linear and that TMAO was the primary mechanism by which fish adapted to pressure. However, recent genetic studies have revealed that the story is more complicated. At the most extreme depths, TMAO alone may not be sufficient. There appear to be other mechanisms at work, genetic adaptations that allow creatures to survive where TMAO levels would need to be impractically high. One major adaptation involves the cell membranes, the thin barriers that surround every cell. Membranes are made largely of lipids, fatty molecules arranged in two layers. Under high pressure, membranes can become too rigid, losing their flexibility and their ability to function properly. Deep-sea creatures have membranes with specialized lipids that remain fluid and flexible, even under enormous pressure. These lipids have more unsaturated fatty acids, which have kinks in their molecular structure that prevent them from packing too tightly together. The result is a membrane that stays soft and pliable even when squeezed by the ocean's weight. Another adaptation involves the very structure of deep-sea creatures' bodies. Many hadal fish, the fish that live in the deepest trenches, have skeletons made primarily of cartilage rather than bone. Cartilage is more flexible than bone, less rigid, and perhaps better able to handle pressure without breaking. These fish also tend to have gelatinous, almost translucent bodies with relatively little hard structure. They look fragile, and in a sense they are, but their softness is an adaptation. There's nothing rigid to be crushed, nothing brittle to snap under the weight. Some creatures that live at extreme depths literally cannot survive at the surface. If you bring them up, they fall apart. Their proteins, adapted to function under high pressure, become unstable without that pressure. Their membranes, designed for the deep, become too loose and leaky in the low pressure of shallow water. They're so specialized for their environment that they've lost the ability to live anywhere else. In a strange way, they need the pressure. It's not crushing them, it's holding them together. Invertebrates like amphipods and sea cucumbers face similar challenges and have evolved similar solutions. They lack air spaces, their bodies are largely water, and they have specialized biochemistry that keeps their proteins working properly. Some amphipods in the Mariana Trench grow unusually large, reaching several inches in length, far bigger than their shallow water cousins. Why this happens isn't entirely clear, but it may be related to the cold, the pressure, or the scarcity of food driving evolutionary pressures in unexpected directions. Microbes, bacteria, and archaea also thrive at extreme depths. Their cells are simpler than those of animals, but they still must contend with pressure. They do so through similar means, with membrane adaptations and pressure-resistant enzymes. Some of these microbes live in the sediments on the seafloor, processing the limited organic matter that rains down from above, forming the base of the hadal food web. Others live in symbiosis with larger creatures, providing nutrients in exchange for shelter. What's remarkable is that life didn't just evolve once to handle pressure and then colonize the deep. It happened multiple times, independently, in different lineages. Creatures from different evolutionary branches found their way into the abyss and evolved their own solutions to the same problems. This convergent evolution suggests that the problems posed by pressure have a limited set of viable solutions, and that life, given enough time, will find those solutions. The deep ocean is not a refuge from evolution. It's a harsh, demanding environment that shapes its inhabitants just as surely as any other place on Earth. The creatures that live there are not primitive holdovers from ancient times, unchanged relics. They're highly specialized, finely tuned to their world, carrying in their genes and their biochemistry the solutions to one of the most extreme challenges life faces anywhere on the planet. For a long time, scientists understood that deep-sea creatures had adaptations for surviving pressure, but the genetic basis of those adaptations remained mysterious. What specific changes in DNA allowed fish to live at depths that would crush their shallow water relatives? What mutations made the difference between life and death in the hadal zone? These questions required sophisticated genetic analysis to answer, and only in recent years have we begun to get answers. In 2023 and 2025, researchers published groundbreaking studies that examined the genomes of multiple deep-sea fish species, comparing them to their shallow water relatives to identify the genetic changes that enable deep-sea life. What they found was fascinating and somewhat unexpected. Rather than discovering hundreds of different genetic adaptations unique to each species, they found evidence of convergent evolution, the same genetic changes appearing independently in different lineages of fish that colonized the deep ocean. One of the most significant discoveries involved a gene called OTF1. This gene encodes a protein involved in transcription, the process by which cells read DNA and produce the messenger RNA that guides protein synthesis. In deep-sea fish living below 3,000 meters, researchers found a highly conserved mutation in the OTF1 gene. This mutation wasn't found in shallow water fish, but it appeared in nearly every deep-sea species they examined, across different fish families that evolved their deep-sea lifestyle independently. When researchers tested this mutation in laboratory settings, they found that it enhanced transcription efficiency specifically under high-pressure conditions. In other words, the mutation allowed cells to read their DNA and produce proteins more effectively when subjected to pressure that would normally disrupt these processes. This appears to be a key adaptation, a genetic change that makes fundamental cellular processes work properly in the deep ocean. The fact that this same mutation evolved independently in multiple lineages suggests that it's one of a limited number of viable solutions to the problem of maintaining cellular function under pressure. This discovery somewhat upended the previous understanding of how fish adapt to pressure. For years, the focus had been primarily on TMAO, the small molecule that stabilizes proteins. TMAO is certainly important, and deep-sea fish do have higher concentrations of it. But TMAO alone doesn't fully explain how fish survive the very deepest parts of the ocean. There appears to be a limit to how much TMAO a fish can accumulate without it becoming toxic or interfering with other cellular processes. The ROTF1 mutation represents a different kind of adaptation, one that works at the level of gene expression rather than protein stabilization. Researchers also discovered other genetic changes associated with deep-sea life. Hadal snailfish, the deepest living fish ever recorded, have multiple copies of certain genes that help them cope with the unique challenges of their environment. One gene called FALV27, which encodes a protein called ferritin, exists in 14 copies in Hadal snailfish, but only 3 copies in their shallow water relatives. Ferritin is involved in managing iron in cells and may also help protect against oxidative stress, the damage caused by reactive oxygen species. High pressure appears to increase oxidative stress, and having extra copies of this protective gene may be crucial for survival. Deep-sea fish have also undergone changes in their sensory genes. Many have lost the genes for seeing in color, retaining only the genes for seeing in dim blue light, which is the only light that penetrates to their depths. Their eyes are often large, adapted to gather as much of the faint bioluminescent light as possible. Some have enhanced their hearing, developing extra copies of genes involved in auditory processing, perhaps to better detect the sounds of predators or prey in the darkness. Circadian rhythm genes, the genes that regulate day-night cycles in most organisms, are often absent or barely expressed in deep-sea fish. This makes sense because there is no day-night cycle in the deep ocean. The darkness is constant. Having a circadian rhythm would be pointless, so evolution has eliminated it. However, some essential clock control genes are still present and expressed, suggesting that fish retain some kind of internal timing mechanism, though what it's used for in the absence of light cues remains unclear. The story of how fish colonized the deep ocean also emerged from genetic studies. It turns out there were 2 main pathways. Some deep-sea fish are ancient survivors, lineages that have lived in the deep ocean for tens or even hundreds of millions of years. These fish were already in the deep before the mass extinction event that killed the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. They represent old bloodlines, families that found their way into the abyss early in their evolutionary history and stayed there. Other deep-sea fish are new immigrants, species that colonized the deep ocean more recently, after the extinction of the dinosaurs. These fish descended from shallow water ancestors within the last few tens of millions of years. Their journey into the deep was more recent in evolutionary terms, but they still had to evolve the same adaptations, the same genetic changes that allow survival under pressure. The fact that both ancient survivors and new immigrants show similar genetic adaptations suggests that these adaptations are necessary, and that there are only so many ways to solve the problem of living in the deep. Genetic studies have also revealed evidence of gene loss. Deep-sea fish have lost genes that are no longer useful in their environment. Genes for producing light-sensitive pigments at wavelengths that don't exist in the deep ocean have been discarded. Genes for metabolic pathways that aren't efficient in the cold have been modified or eliminated. Evolution doesn't just add new features, it also strips away unnecessary ones, streamlining the genome to focus on what matters. One particularly interesting finding is that some of the genetic adaptations seen in deep-sea fish are also found in other animals that experience high pressure, such as deep-diving mammals like sperm whales. This suggests that the fundamental challenges of pressure are similar across different animal groups, and that convergent evolution can occur not just among fish but across much broader taxonomic boundaries. The genetic research has also raised new questions. How quickly can these adaptations evolve? If a population of fish were isolated in a deep-sea trench, how many generations would it take for the beneficial mutations to spread, and for the population to become fully adapted to the deep? Do some genetic backgrounds make it easier to evolve deep-sea adaptations, or can any fish lineage potentially make the transition given enough time? These are questions that will require more study, more genetic data, and more sophisticated evolutionary modeling to answer. What's clear is that the ability to live in the deep ocean is not a simple trait controlled by a single gene. It's a complex suite of adaptations involving multiple genes, multiple biochemical pathways, and multiple levels of biological organization. From the way cells transcribe their DNA to the composition of cell membranes to the structure of proteins to the overall body plan, everything must be coordinated to work under pressure. It's a reminder that adaptation to extreme environments is a whole organism phenomenon, requiring changes throughout the body and throughout the genome. And perhaps most remarkably, these adaptations evolved multiple times in different lineages in different oceans over millions of years. The deep ocean has been colonized again and again by creatures that found ways to solve the pressure problem. Each time, evolution found similar solutions, tweaking the same genes, modifying the same proteins, arriving at the same basic strategies. It's a powerful example of how natural selection working on random mutations can produce predictable results when faced with consistent environmental challenges. For humans, the deep ocean is not a natural habitat. We are air-breathing mammals adapted to life on land or at best swimming near the surface. To explore the depths, we must bring our environment with us, encased in metal and engineering. This presents enormous challenges, because the structures we build must withstand pressures that can destroy almost anything. The primary challenge in designing a deep-sea vehicle is creating a pressure hull, a sealed compartment that can maintain a safe internal pressure while surrounded by crushing external forces. This is the opposite problem from designing a spacecraft, which must maintain pressure inside while surrounded by vacuum outside. But in some ways, the pressure differences are even more extreme in the ocean. The vacuum of space is only 1 atmosphere below sea level pressure. The pressure at the bottom of the Mariana Trench is more than 1,000 atmospheres above it. The shape of a pressure hull matters enormously. A sphere is the ideal shape for resisting external pressure because it distributes the force evenly across its entire surface. Every point on a sphere is equidistant from the center, which means the pressure pushes inward uniformly, and the internal structure of the sphere resists it with equal efficiency in all directions. Many deep-sea submersibles use spherical pressure hulls for the occupied compartment where humans sit. The sphere can be small, just large enough for 1 or 2 people, which keeps the material costs and weight down while maximizing strength. Cylinders are the next best shape, and they're used in submarines that need more interior space. A cylinder resists external pressure reasonably well along its length, though it requires reinforcement, usually in the form of ring stiffeners that prevent the cylinder from being crushed. The ends of the cylinder must be carefully designed, often using hemispherical or elliptical caps that transition the shape back toward a sphere. Even with these precautions, a cylindrical hull is not as strong as a spherical one of the same wall thickness. Other shapes are much worse. A cube or any shape with flat walls or sharp corners is a terrible choice for a pressure hull. Flat surfaces don't distribute pressure evenly. The force concentrates in the center of the flat area, creating stress concentrations that can lead to failure. Sharp corners are even worse because they create stress concentrations at the corners themselves. This is why you never see submersibles with square hulls. The engineering just doesn't work. The material of the pressure hull is critical. For most deep-sea vehicles, high-strength steel has been the material of choice. Specific alloys like HI-80 and HI-100 steel, developed originally for military submarines, offer excellent strength-to-weight ratios and are well understood by engineers. These steels can withstand enormous stress without yielding or fracturing, and they've been proven in countless dives. Titanium is also used, particularly by Russian and Soviet engineers, because it has an even better strength-to-weight ratio and doesn't corrode in seawater. Titanium is harder to work with and more expensive, but for the deepest dives, it can be worth the cost. Thickness matters too. The deeper you want to go, the thicker your hull must be. A pressure hull designed for 600 feet might use steel a half-inch thick. A hull designed for 36,000 feet might need to be several inches thick, which adds enormous weight. This creates a vicious cycle because the heavier the hull, the more buoyancy you need to bring it back to the surface, which means more equipment, which means more weight, which means more strength needed in the hull. Designing a vehicle that can reach the deepest depths while still being small enough and light enough to be practical is an immense challenge. Windows are a particularly difficult problem. Humans want to see the outside world, but creating a transparent viewport that can withstand deep-sea pressure is not easy. Glass is strong in compression, which helps, but it's also brittle and can fail catastrophically if there's a flaw or if the stress becomes too great. deep-sea viewports are typically made of very thick acrylic or specially formulated glass, shaped into a cone or truncated cone that seats into a matching hole in the pressure hull. The pressure pushes the viewport into its seat, actually helping to seal it. But even with this design, viewports are a weak point, a place where failure is possible, and they limit how deep a vehicle can safely go. Penetrations through the pressure hull, places where cables or pipes or mechanical linkages pass through, are another weak point. Each penetration must be carefully sealed, and the seals must maintain their integrity under pressure. O-rings and mechanical seals can work, but they require precise engineering and high-quality materials. Too many penetrations, and the hull becomes riddled with potential failure points. In recent years, there has been interest in using composite materials like carbon fiber for pressure hulls. Carbon fiber is incredibly strong and light, which seems ideal. However, it has serious limitations for this application. Carbon fiber is strong in tension when you're pulling on it, but the deep ocean creates compression. Carbon fiber can be made to work in compression, but it's more complicated. The material is also anisotropic, meaning its properties depend on direction, and it's susceptible to manufacturing defects like voids or delamination where layers separate. These defects can be hard to detect and can lead to sudden catastrophic failure. The Titan submersible disaster in 2023 illustrated the dangers of using novel materials without adequate testing. Titan's pressure hull was made of carbon fiber, and multiple experts had warned that this was risky for deep-sea use. The vehicle had been downgraded from its original depth rating because of concerns about cyclic fatigue, the weakening that occurs when a structure is repeatedly stressed and relaxed. On its dive to the Titanic wreck site, at a depth of about 12,000 feet, the hull apparently imploded, killing everyone aboard instantly. The exact cause is still under investigation, but the incident has reinforced the conservative approach most deep-sea engineers take. Proven materials and proven designs are safer, even if they're heavier and more expensive. Life support is another major challenge. Humans need oxygen to breathe, and we produce carbon dioxide that must be removed from the air. In a sealed pressure hull, this means you need oxygen bottles and carbon dioxide scrubbers, usually chemical systems that absorb CO2 from the air. These systems must be reliable because there's no way to get fresh air once you're deep underwater. Power is also essential, for lights, for instruments, for controlling the vehicle. Batteries are typically used, but they add weight, and they have limited capacity. A deep-sea dive might last 8 to 12 hours or more, and the vehicle must have enough power to operate for the entire duration, plus reserve capacity in case something goes wrong. Temperature control is necessary, because the deep ocean is cold, often just above freezing. Without heating, the interior of a submersible would quickly become dangerously cold. Insulation helps, but it adds more weight. Heating systems consume power, putting demands on the batteries. Balancing all these requirements while keeping the vehicle small enough and light enough to function is a constant struggle. Navigation is difficult in the deep ocean because GPS doesn't work underwater. Radio waves, which GPS relies on, don't penetrate water effectively. Instead, submersibles use acoustic navigation, sending and receiving sound signals to determine their position relative to surface ships or underwater beacons. Sonar can map the surroundings, but it has limited range and resolution. In many ways, navigating the deep ocean is like navigating in space. You're in a vast, dark, featureless expanse, and you must rely on instruments and careful planning to avoid getting lost. Despite all these challenges, humans have successfully built vehicles that can reach full ocean depth. The Bathyscaphe Trest did it in 1960. The Deep-Sea Challenger did it in 2012. The DSV limiting factor has done it multiple times in recent years, proving that repeated dives to the deepest points are possible with the right design. These vehicles represent the pinnacle of pressure engineering, machines built to withstand forces that few other human-made structures ever experience. They are small, expensive, and in many ways fragile, but they work, and they've opened the deepest parts of the ocean to direct human observation. To understand why pressure is such a challenge, it helps to understand what happens when pressure increases. At a fundamental level, pressure is about how closely atoms and molecules are packed together. Increase the pressure, and you're trying to push atoms closer. For gases, this is relatively easy. Gas molecules are far apart, with lots of empty space between them. Apply pressure, and the molecules are forced together, reducing the volume of the gas. This relationship is described by Boyle's law, which states that for a gas at constant temperature, pressure and volume are inversely related. Double the pressure, and you halve the volume. This is why air spaces are such a problem at depth. Your lungs, if you were at the surface and holding your breath, might contain several liters of air. Take those lungs to 33 feet, and the pressure doubles, so the volume of air would be compressed to half, assuming your lungs could be compressed. In reality, your chest wall and the structure of your lungs can't be compressed that much, which is why you can't simply hold your breath and dive deep. The pressure would try to collapse your chest, and it would fail long before you reach significant depth. Scuba divers solve this problem by breathing air that's been compressed to match the surrounding water pressure. Your regulator delivers air at the same pressure as the water at whatever depth you're at. This keeps your lungs inflated normally because the air pressure inside your lungs equals the water pressure outside your body. But this creates a different problem. The air you're breathing is denser than normal. At 33 feet, the air is twice as dense as at the surface. At 100 feet, it's more than 4 times as dense. You're breathing more molecules with each breath, which means you use up your air supply faster. It also means more nitrogen dissolves into your bloodstream, creating the risk of decompression sickness when you ascend. Liquids, on the other hand, don't compress nearly as much as gases. The molecules in a liquid are already close together, held by intermolecular forces. Apply pressure, and you can't easily push them closer because the forces between molecules resist. Water is a particularly incompressible liquid. Even at the extreme pressures of the deepest ocean, water compresses by only a few percent. This is why creatures that are mostly water don't suffer the same problems humans do. Their bodies aren't trying to compress. But pressure does affect other things. It affects chemical reactions, because bringing molecules closer together changes how they interact. Some reactions proceed faster under pressure, while others slow down. This can affect metabolism in subtle ways. It affects the solubility of gases, as described by Henry's law. The higher the pressure, the more gas can dissolve into a liquid. This is why nitrogen dissolves into a diver's blood at depth, and why it must be carefully released when ascending to avoid it forming bubbles. Pressure affects the structure of proteins and other large molecules. As we've discussed, the weak bonds that hold a protein in its proper shape can be disrupted by pressure, causing the protein to unfold or misfold. This is a major reason why pressure is dangerous to life. If your proteins stop working because they've changed shape, your cells can't function, and you die. Deep-sea creatures have evolved proteins that resist this effect, proteins that are naturally more stable or that are stabilized by molecules like TMAO. Pressure also affects the state of matter. At very high pressures, materials can undergo phase transitions, changing from one form to another. Ice, for instance, comes in many different crystal structures, and which form exists depends on temperature and pressure. At the pressures of the deep ocean, water remains liquid, but if it was somehow cooled, it might freeze into exotic forms of ice that don't exist at surface pressure. These effects are mostly academic for understanding the ocean, but they illustrate just how fundamental pressure is as a physical variable. The speed of sound in water increases with pressure. Sound travels through water by compressing and expanding the water in a wave pattern. Under high pressure, the water is already compressed, and this changes how the sound wave propagates. Deep in the ocean, sound travels faster than it does near the surface. This has practical implications for sonar and for acoustic communication, because sound waves bend as they move through regions of different pressure and temperature. Heat capacity, the amount of energy needed to raise the temperature of a substance, is also affected by pressure, though the effect is usually small. At high pressure, water can absorb slightly more heat before its temperature rises. This is a minor factor, but it's one more way that the deep ocean is subtly different from the surface. Buoyancy is affected by pressure in an indirect way. Buoyancy depends on the density of water, and water density increases slightly with pressure. This means that the deep ocean is very slightly more buoyant than the surface. A submarine or submersible that's neutrally buoyant at the surface will be slightly positively buoyant in the deep ocean, assuming its own density doesn't change. However, the submarine's hull is compressed by the pressure, which reduces its volume and increases its density, so the net effect is complicated and must be carefully calculated. The key insight from all of this is that pressure is not just a single effect. It's a fundamental physical parameter that influences many different aspects of how matter behaves. In the deep ocean, Pressure becomes one of the defining characteristics of the environment, shaping everything from the chemistry of seawater, to the biology of life, to the engineering of exploration vehicles. It's an invisible force, something you can't see or hear or directly sense, but it's always there, pressing in from all directions, a constant reminder that the ocean is a powerful and unforgiving place. Mammals are not naturally adapted for life underwater. We breathe air, we have lungs filled with gas, and we maintain our body temperature internally, all of which make diving challenging. And yet some mammals have become extraordinary divers, capable of reaching depths that would kill a human without protection. Whales, seals, and sea lions routinely dive to hundreds or even thousands of feet, holding their breath for extended periods while hunting in the cold darkness below. The deepest divers among mammals are certain species of beaked whales and sperm whales. Cuvier's beaked whales have been recorded diving to depths of nearly 10,000 feet and staying submerged for over 2 hours. Sperm whales regularly hunt at depths of 3,000 feet or more, pursuing giant squid in the darkness. These dives are remarkable feats of physiology, requiring adaptations that allow the animal to cope with pressure, cold, and the need to hold its breath for extended periods. One major adaptation is the structure of their lungs and rib cage. Unlike humans, whose ribs are rigid, the ribs of deep diving mammals are flexible, bound by cartilage that allows them to bend under pressure. As the animal descends and the pressure increases, the lungs are gradually compressed. Rather than resisting this compression, the animal allows it to happen. The lungs collapse, and the air inside is pushed into the rigid airways, the trachea and bronchi, which don't collapse as easily. This reduces the volume of gas in the body, which reduces the amount of nitrogen that dissolves into the bloodstream, which in turn reduces the risk of decompression sickness when the animal ascends. Deep diving mammals also have extraordinarily high concentrations of myoglobin in their muscles. Myoglobin is a protein that stores oxygen, similar to hemoglobin in blood but located in muscle tissue. Whales and seals have so much myoglobin that their muscles are nearly black in color. This allows them to carry large stores of oxygen in their muscles, which they can use during the dive when they're not breathing. In essence, they're living on stored oxygen, much like a scuba diver lives on the air in their tank, except the oxygen is stored in their body rather than in a piece of equipment. Their blood also has adaptations. They have higher concentrations of hemoglobin, the protein that carries oxygen in red blood cells, which allows their blood to carry more oxygen per unit volume. They can also tolerate much higher levels of carbon dioxide than we can. Normally, rising CO2 levels in the blood trigger the urge to breathe. Dive-adapted mammals can suppress this urge, continuing to hold their breath even as CO2 builds up to levels that would cause a human to panic. When these animals dive, their heart rate slows dramatically, a reflex called bradycardia. A whale that might have a heart rate of 20 to 30 beats per minute at the surface might slow to just a few beats per minute during a deep dive. This conserves oxygen because the heart itself is a major consumer of oxygen, and reducing its activity means the oxygen stored in muscles and blood will last longer. Blood flow is also redirected, shunted away from less essential organs and focused on the brain and heart, the organs that absolutely must continue functioning. Despite all these adaptations, deep diving mammals are not immune to decompression sickness, commonly known as the bends. For a long time, scientists thought whales couldn't get the bends because they don't breathe compressed air like scuba divers do. But it turns out that whales can suffer from decompression sickness, particularly if they're forced to make rapid, uncontrolled ascents, such as when fleeing from sonar or other disturbances. Some strandings of beaked whales have been linked to symptoms that look like decompression sickness, with gas bubbles found in their tissues during necropsy. How whales normally avoid the bends is still a topic of research. One theory is that by collapsing their lungs at depth, they minimize the amount of nitrogen dissolving into their blood. Another is that they ascend slowly and make controlled stops on the way up, much like a scuba diver does, allowing nitrogen to off-gas gradually. Their physiology may also be more resistant to bubble formation, or they may have mechanisms for clearing bubbles more effectively than humans do. The full story is not yet understood, but it's clear that these animals have evolved ways to manage the gas dynamics of repeated deep dives. Elephant seals are another remarkable example. These seals dive continuously, day and night, for months at a time when they're at sea. They surface only briefly between dives, just long enough to take a few breaths before descending again. Some of their dives reach depths of over a mile, and they spend the vast majority of their time underwater. This lifestyle requires not just tolerance of pressure but extreme efficiency in oxygen use and an ability to recover quickly between dives. One interesting adaptation in seals is that they exhale before diving. This seems counterintuitive because it means they're starting the dive with less oxygen, but exhaling reduces the amount of air in the lungs, which reduces buoyancy and makes it easier to descend. It also reduces the total amount of nitrogen in the body, which reduces the risk of nitrogen absorption and decompression issues. The seal relies more heavily on the oxygen stored in its blood and muscles, rather than the oxygen in its lungs. These adaptations highlight a key difference between how mammals and fish handle pressure. Fish, as we've discussed, don't have gas-filled spaces and are largely unaffected by pressure once they've adapted their biochemistry. Mammals, on the other hand, must actively manage the gas in their bodies, collapsing air spaces, storing oxygen in tissues, and carefully controlling their dive profiles to avoid injury. They're working against their air-breathing heritage, using clever physiological tricks to extend their time underwater. The fact that mammals have independently evolved deep diving capabilities multiple times, in different lineages and in different oceans, suggests that the evolutionary pressures to exploit deep-sea resources are strong. The deep ocean is full of food, particularly fish and squid, and mammals that can access those resources gain a significant advantage. But reaching those resources requires overcoming the challenges of pressure, breath-holding, and darkness, challenges that have driven the evolution of some of the most extreme physiological adaptations in the animal kingdom. Pressure is invisible, but its effects are everywhere in the ocean. It influences where creatures can live, how they've evolved, how water moves, and even how sound travels. It's one of the fundamental organizing principles of the ocean, as important as temperature or salinity or light. The layering of the ocean, the division into different zones we discussed earlier, is partly a result of pressure. Creatures adapted to one pressure range typically can't survive in another. A fish from the surface brought to the deep ocean would be crushed by its own failure to handle the pressure, its proteins denaturing and its cellular processes failing. Conversely, a deep-sea fish brought to the surface would suffer as its pressure-adapted systems stopped working in the low-pressure environment. This creates barriers, invisible walls that separate populations and drive the evolution of distinct communities at different depths. Pressure also interacts with temperature in important ways. In the deep ocean, the temperature is nearly constant, hovering just above freezing. This is cold enough that water is very dense, and combined with the high pressure, this creates a stable, stratified environment. Water at the bottom of the ocean is both cold and under immense pressure, which makes it denser than the warmer, less pressurized water above. This density difference prevents mixing. The deep water stays deep, the surface water stays at the surface, and the layers remain distinct. This stratification affects the entire ocean circulation. Surface currents are driven by wind and the sun's heat, but deep currents, the great slow rivers of cold water that flow along the ocean floor, are driven by density differences created by temperature and salinity, and pressure plays a role in how that density is distributed. These deep currents can take centuries to complete a circuit, carrying water from the polar regions where it sinks, across the ocean basins at depth, and eventually back to the surface in regions of upwelling. Pressure helps maintain the separation between these layers, keeping the deep circulation distinct from the surface circulation. Sound behaves strangely in the ocean, and pressure is one reason why. The speed of sound in water depends on temperature, salinity, and pressure. In general, sound travels faster in warmer water, saltier water, and higher pressure water, but these factors can work against each other. Near the surface, water is warm but low pressure. In the deep, water is high pressure but cold. This creates a layer, typically around 3,000 feet deep, where sound reaches a minimum speed. This layer is called the SOFAR channel, which stands for sound fixing and ranging channel, and it acts like a waveguide for sound. Sound waves that enter the SOFAR channel tend to stay in it, bending back toward the channel whenever they try to leave. This allows sound to travel for enormous distances underwater with very little loss. Whales use the SOFAR channel to communicate across ocean basins. During the Cold War, the US Navy used it to listen for submarines, deploying hydrophones in the channel to detect sounds from thousands of miles away. The existence of the SOFAR channel is a direct result of how pressure affects sound speed, an invisible acoustic layer created by the interplay of depth and physics. Pressure also affects the chemistry of seawater in subtle ways. The solubility of gases, the rates of chemical reactions, and the stability of certain chemical species all depend on pressure. Calcium carbonate, the material that makes up shells and coral skeletons, is more soluble at high pressure. This is one reason why the deep ocean is corrosive to shells. The pressure, combined with the cold and the higher concentrations of dissolved CO2 at depth, creates conditions where calcium carbonate tends to dissolve rather than precipitate. This puts a depth limit on many shell-forming organisms and affects where coral reefs can grow. The carbon cycle in the ocean is influenced by pressure as well. Carbon dioxide from the atmosphere dissolves into surface water, where it's used by phytoplankton for photosynthesis. When those phytoplankton die, they sink, carrying carbon into the deep ocean. At depth, the carbon is released as the organic matter decomposes. This carbon can stay in the deep ocean for centuries, effectively sequestering it from the atmosphere. Pressure helps keep this carbon locked away because the high pressure and cold temperatures reduce mixing between the deep ocean and the surface. Even the formation of oil and gas deposits deep beneath the seafloor is influenced by pressure. Organic matter buried in sediments is subjected to increasing pressure and temperature as it's buried deeper and deeper over millions of years. The pressure, along with heat, transforms the organic matter into hydrocarbons, the oil and gas that humans extract. In a sense, pressure is part of the process that creates fossil fuels, though this happens on geological timescales far below the seafloor itself. Pressure affects the viscosity of water, though the effect is small. At very high pressures, water becomes slightly more viscous, slightly thicker. This affects how quickly particles settle through the water column, and how easily water can flow through sediments on the seafloor. These are minor effects in most contexts, but they illustrate how pervasive pressure's influence is. The behavior of volcanic vents on the seafloor is also shaped by pressure. When molten rock erupts underwater at depth, it's under enormous pressure that affects how the lava flows and cools. Lava erupted at depth forms pillow-shaped structures because the outer surface cools rapidly in contact with cold water, forming a skin, while the interior remains molten and pushes outward, creating bulbous, pillow-like forms. The pressure prevents the water from boiling and keeps the lava in a relatively coherent form, rather than shattering into fragments. Hydrothermal vents, the deep-sea hot springs where superheated water gushes from cracks in the seafloor, exist because of pressure. At the surface, water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, but at depth, under high pressure, water can be heated to over 700 degrees Fahrenheit without boiling. This superheated water dissolves minerals from the rock, and when it emerges from the vent into the cold seawater, those minerals precipitate out, forming chimney-like structures and supporting unique communities of bacteria and animals that depend on the chemical energy from the vents. In all these ways and more, pressure is woven into the fabric of the ocean. It's not just something that makes diving difficult or that deep-sea creatures must adapt to. It's a fundamental physical reality that shapes the ocean's structure, its chemistry, its biology, and even its geology. Understanding pressure is essential to understanding the ocean as a whole, and recognizing its influence helps us appreciate just how different the deep ocean is from the surface world we know. Pressure is always there in the ocean, from the gentlest increase you feel when you duck your head beneath the surface to the incomprehensible force at the bottom of the deepest trenches. It's a reminder that the ocean is not our element, that we are visitors in a realm shaped by forces we cannot personally withstand. And yet, life thrives there. In every depth zone, from the sunlit surface to the pitch-black Hadal trenches, creatures have found ways to not just survive but flourish. They've evolved bodies that turn pressure from a threat into simply another aspect of their environment. They've developed proteins that work better under pressure, membranes that stay flexible when squeezed, and biochemistry that functions in conditions we can barely imagine. The ocean's pressure is a testament to the power of evolution, to the ability of life to adapt to extremes. It's also a testament to the ocean's complexity, the way physical forces like pressure interact with temperature and light and chemistry to create a three-dimensional mosaic of habitats, each with its own challenges and its own inhabitants. For humans, understanding pressure has allowed us to explore parts of the ocean that were once completely beyond reach. Through engineering and ingenuity, we've built vehicles that can carry us to the deepest depths, if only briefly, if only in small numbers. We've developed technologies that let us observe and sample and study the deep ocean, learning about creatures and processes that were unknown just decades ago. But even with all our technology, the deep ocean remains largely unexplored. The pressures there are so extreme, the distances so vast, that we've barely scratched the surface. Most of the ocean below 600 feet has never been seen by human eyes. Most of the species that live there have never been catalogued. There are entire ecosystems, entire communities of organisms, thriving under pressures that would crush us instantly, and we know almost nothing about them. As you rest tonight, consider the ocean's vastness, its depth, the weight of all that water pressing down. Imagine the creatures moving through the darkness, unfazed by forces that would destroy us. Think of the Hadal snailfish, translucent and delicate-looking, swimming gracefully at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, under more than 1,000 atmospheres of pressure, living its life as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Because for that fish, it is natural, its home. The ocean's pressure is invisible, silent, and utterly relentless, but it's also beautiful in its way. A physical law written into the structure of the universe, shaping one of the planet's most important and least understood realms. Understanding it helps us understand the ocean itself, and understanding the ocean helps us understand the living world we're part of. And so tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let yourself imagine sinking slowly through the water column, layer by layer, zone by zone, feeling the pressure increase with every foot of depth. The light fades, the temperature drops, and the weight above grows heavier and heavier. But you're safe in your mind, floating peacefully, observing without danger, learning about a place where physics and biology meet in remarkable ways. The ocean's depths are calling, have always been calling, to those curious enough to wonder what lies beneath. And though we may never be able to visit in person without elaborate technology, we can still appreciate the majesty of those depths, the strange beauty of a world shaped by crushing force, and the resilience of life that finds a way, always finds a way, no matter how extreme the challenge. Rest now, and let the ocean's secrets wash over you gently, like waves lapping at a shore, carrying you softly towards sleep.